You are listening to Breaking Boundaries with Brad Palumbo.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. Really loving doing this podcast for you guys so far. We've been getting thousands of downloads every single episode, and I just couldn't be happier with how it's going. One thing I'm going to be trying to do in the next couple of months with the show is bring in a different type of guest that you might not get from your stereotypical conservative podcast. I want to talk to more people who are a part of the online alternative media, the YouTube stars, the podcasters, and not just the traditional politicians and think tankers and journalists and old school media. So I'm really happy with the guest that I have today, Hunter Avallone. He is a very successful YouTuber who's actually undergone a bit of a political transition. He started out as kind of a right-wing sensation on YouTube, but has recently come to reject some of his old views, and now he identifies as center-left. So I'm really excited to have a conversation with him. And Hunter, thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on, Brad. And thank you very much for the kind introduction.
Yeah, so I guess to start, before we even get into the political side of things, I'd be interested to just hear how you got started on YouTube, right? Because you were you go way back on there, and the platform's changed, but I'd be interested to hear your story on that front.
Yeah, sure. I did YouTube for a long time. I was into I was into doing video editing and filming and writing and all that crap basically since I was able to pick up a video camera. Before that, I would do audio dramas, and then I started making movies with my siblings when I was like 7, 8, 9. Wow. Maybe actually a little older than that. I guess it would be closer to 9, 10, or 11. But fast forward a little ways, when I hit my teen years, me and my brother just started uploading some funny skits to YouTube. I was on a different channel at the time, and I remember my first video I put up there with him got 100 views in like 2 days, and I was like, I couldn't believe, I saw my video with over 100 views. I remember I thought it was the most impressive thing ever. So from that point on, we started to just make little skits, but I was also in the midst of actually making a movie off of YouTube. At the time, I was making this little horror movie, which now it's pretty cheesy, but it was fun at the time. I never really wanted to do YouTube when I was little. I just wanted to do video stuff. But making these big, long movies, especially even making like YouTube skits with my siblings, it just proved to be very challenging. They weren't as passionate about this as I was. So it was late 2014 that I then started really seriously uploading content on my current channel, the Hunter Avallone channel. And I started with doing commentary on stupid things on the internet. And then that sort of moved into politics and then social commentary. And that kind of slowly but surely through 2014 and all through even 2015, because it wasn't until near the end of 2015 that I really started jumping on the I hate feminism kind of bandwagon. So my channel went through a lot of slow transitions, until finally I kind of found what worked and I found what I liked best. And that was just talking politics. And so from that point on, I just rolled with it. Sorry, that was kind of long-winded.
No, it's good. When did the channel kind of take off? When did it start to, cross the 10,000, 100,000 subscriber threshold, the 500,000 subscriber threshold? I'd be interested to kind of hear, was it slow and steady, or was there a certain time where it kind of exponentially began to grow?
It was a little bit of both. So for contrast, right now my channel is bleeding out, obviously, because I built my channel on being on the right, and now that I'm not really a right wing anymore, people are kind of mad. But it sort of started slow and steady, but then it slowly but surely got better. And it's kind of like a snowball effect. Once you pick up that 20K and you keep your momentum going, you just grow faster and faster. Of course, I made the mistake of kind of stepping in the way of my momentum right now, but I can handle it. But yeah, I blew up really with my video, The Truth About Transgenders, which actually I think might be an interesting conversation for us to have at some point, because LGBT issues were one of the first and most major positions that I changed my opinions on. So, back in, it would have been the beginning of 2016, my video, The Truth About Transgenders, went viral for all the wrong reasons. It was all mostly hate that I was getting, but I still surpassed over 10,000 subscribers with that controversy. And And from that point on, I just kept on rolling with it. And then, yeah, the beginning of 2016, I was at like 7K subs. By December of 2016, I was at over 200,000.
Wow.
So it just picked up. I had some very successful videos. And even though my channel is in a pretty challenging spot now, as opposed to when I was blowing up, I've still had consistent content doing quite well. A video that I posted just earlier this year, actually, after I'd already left the right, is sitting over at, I think, 1.3 million hits now. So
that's great.
Still doing my best to still grinding, but it was a long process for sure.
So when you first started out, some of your most popular content, when I go to your channel and I see your most popular uploads, now we will talk about the transgender video and that issue more in depth, because you actually took that one down, I believe, right?
Yep.
And we can discuss that. But some of your other kind of right-wing reactionary videos, I watched one where you went to a DC Pride March to troll.
Yeah.
And you had a T-shirt on that said there are only two genders.
Yeah.
And so I guess what kind of, in a nutshell, what were your views, and do you regret kind of, frankly, like the trollish and reactionary way you kind of went about them back then?
I don't really regret the troll aspect, because I'm still a troll. Like, if you scroll through my Twitter, even if you look at my more recent content, I love to troll. That's why I call myself the guy that you love to hate. Like, my whole shtick is just basically getting a rise out of people and then talking to them about it. So I still love the like trolling aspect, and it turns out it works very well against both liberals and right-wing people. But I do regret using my trolling skills and talents, I think, for the wrong reasons. You know, the two genders thing was very inflammatory. It was a clever idea for sure. And at the time when I was very right-wing and reactionary, I thought that was the funniest shit ever. Looking back now, I don't think there are like more than two genders. But I do think that gender is not a concrete set in stone. There's only two genders. I think there's the possibility that we can have more genders, but I think that society generally recognizes two genders. The position that I would have a problem with now in that video would be, yeah, the idea that there are only set in stone two genders, when you really have an understanding of what gender is versus sex, that's kind of an irrational statement. So I think I react using my trolling talents for the wrong reasons, but I certainly don't regret having the ability to troll and get a rise out of people, because I still use that almost daily.
So that's interesting. And I think that serves you very well in kind of the online ecosystem. It also serves people well in traditional media or traditional conservative media, the kind of own the libs, right-wing, red meat trolls. They do very well for themselves, unfortunately, in my personal opinion, for the state of journalism.
Right.
But it's not the nuanced, thoughtful people who go viral or get invited on cable news all the time. It's the hyper-partisan attack clickbait trolls. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what you do, but I'm saying in general, I actually probably started out my commentary career a little more on that side. So just a little bit about me that you might not know. I went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm from Massachusetts. And I started out kind of not super political, but I went there. It actually has the distinction. I'm an economics writer, first and foremost, and I studied economics in college. And UMass Amherst is the only fully Marxist economics department in the country.
Wow.
So it is an extremely left-wing campus, not just on economics, but also on social justice. So, for example, I got death threats for writing conservative columns. People argued that my position on Title IX due process reform and campus sexual assault proceedings endangered female students and made them unsafe, my ideas. And they signed a petition to get me fired. I eventually was fired from the campus newspaper. But so anyway, there was kind of this I was pushed totally to the right wing just by seeing how insane this far left environment was. And I would say that my policy views are still very right wing on most issues, though kind of with a libertarian bent for sure. But over time, I've become far less partisan and far more willing to see that Republicans and Democrats alike are deeply flawed and worth criticism. I became far less pro-Trump, and now I would not consider myself pro-Trump, and I wasn't through this whole election cycle. So I have kind of gone through something of a transition. I wouldn't say my underlying views have changed as much as kind of my disposition has. But I'd be curious, can you just tell, I guess maybe in brief, because I'm sure it's a long story, but could you just tell people why you went from right wing to kind of center left or centrist?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really big conglomeration of a lot of things. I'll keep it brief, but like I did explain in very long-winded fashion on my video on why I left the right, it was just a lot of things, a lot of, being humbled by life, realizing that I was wrong about some things that I used to think there was no question about it that I was 100% correct in this aspect. There was that, and then I brought up my debate with Vosh, which people who don't like me or don't like Vosh very quickly will say, "Oh, Hunter lost one debate and he quickly changed all of his opinions," or whatever. That's not what happened, right? Like, it was a slow process. I then I debated Vosh, which he did a really good job at showing me some like facts that sort of backed up the LGBT sort of point of view and everything, things that I'd actually never seen before that really caught me off guard, that I after the debate, I actually wanted to look into and learn more about this and see maybe I was incorrect about something. And then I just talked about this on Twitter today, but I also, I've suffered from like anxiety and depression, I think, to a degree, for pretty much all my life. Like, I can actually look back now at times I was like 10 dealing with like OCD anxiety attacks. I just didn't know what it was at the time. And I have since gotten on anxiety medication. And personally, for me, I think that that's really played a serious role in helping me as well, because it helped me kind of get away from thinking with my feelings and instead look at things rationally. And, I realized that a lot of my positions, especially on like trans issues, I thought that my positions were founded on the facts, right? But what it really came down to is that I was using facts that were either dishonest or just flat out wrong, to essentially justify my feelings. So it wasn't like I was all just feelings, just like trans people are bad, oh my God. But it was much more like trans people are bad and here's the facts. But under all that was really just this discomfort with trans people. I didn't understand trans people. I found trans people to be kind of gross and icky. And that was pretty much it. Once I was able to sort of put that aside, and I do think that the Zoloft helped me with like, it's like you don't realize how much your anxiety or your emotions play a role in virtually every aspect of your life until you see what your life is like on that medication versus without it. And I think that was pretty eye-opening also. So it was just a conglomeration of a lot of things. It wasn't like there was no one thing that just turned me to center left. It was more a long process throughout a lot of time, really.
So before we dive into the issues specific, I would be curious, on the right, there's this phenomenon where people who I've always been like before I was apolitical and then I was on the right. So I've never gone through like a political transition really. But there's this category of right-wing commentator who started on the left and then made a big show of why I left the left. And honestly, it propels them to fame. And then they just kind of become a right-wing talking head and they just say all the right things and they join their new team. But then they get and so it's kind of a grift sometimes.
They get that check. Yeah.
So why is it not a grift for you? Are you not getting newfound liberal love?
No. I mean, you can go look at my channel. I since my why I lost the right video, why I left the right video that I published back in, I think, April now, I've lost 60, maybe 70,000 subscribers. So whenever people call me a grifter for stuff like this, I mean, when I was doing my right-wing stuff, I was in I was one of the top 10 biggest right-wing channels on YouTube. If I wanted to be a grifter and just make money by peddling crap I didn't believe, I would have just kept on doing what I was doing.
Right.
So for me to be like public about leaving the right, which is where I built the most of my audience on, has seriously negatively impacted my channel. You can even go look go look at my recent videos. Look at how low the views are as opposed to how they used to be. I mean, there is no grift here. Like, if I wanted to grift, if I was in it for the money, going to center left and basically losing 70,000 subscribers and ostracizing a huge chunk of my original base, that's not the way you grift. Like, no, I mean, and you know what, to be completely honest, I like to try and be charitable. I think that there are a lot of right-wing grifters. I think that these people sometimes don't even realize that they're grifters. I think that it's so easy to be a grifter because the right will accept virtually any level of mediocrity as long as you are saying what they want to hear. So some of these people, I think they're sincere, but I just think they're kind of like sincerely stupid, like Dave Rubin.
Well, so I'm not commenting on Dave, but kind of in general, I will say there's feedback loops. And like you kind of said, your first video that blew up was an anti-trans, very antagonistic video. And so it incentivizes you to do more. And and that's not necessarily a conscious decision as much as it is kind of the way that tribalism fuels our media consumption. I mean, I struggled with this as a young conservative journalist. I am not a party line person. I have dissenting views on a number of issues. But when I would write anti-Democrat content, I would get lots of traffic, which is how my performance at work was judged. When I would do a criticism of Trump, I wouldn't get very much traffic. When I would
probably got more hate too, right?
Well, yeah, but so if you get hate, that's okay as long as it comes with the traffic. The worst thing is that your anti-Trump stuff would just be flat. And so all the incentive structures, right? What would I get invited on Fox News to talk about? Only if I wrote about why Elizabeth Warren was bad. And it's not that I didn't believe that. I did disagree with her plans. I did think she was extreme and radical. But it's just that the incentive structure very clearly pushed me into focusing on one thing. And that's something I try to combat in my work, where it's like, okay, well, out of all the articles I've written this month, is there some balance here, right? Like within my views, I'm not just constantly doing anti-Democrat, anti-left content because that's what gets the most clicks. It still is what gets the most clicks. But yeah, actually my most viral article ever was dunking on Megan Rapinoe. And I don't disagree with my kind of argument that her feminism is cheap, and I don't agree with the soccer pay gap narrative. And we don't have to get into all that. But I will say that why did I write 6 articles about her in the span of 2 months? It's because the clicks kept coming in and coming in.
And there's also like a really weird balance, especially when you're doing stuff online, because it's like, it's your job. So you have to think of it from a business standpoint, partially, which is still like, I'm not afraid to say like, yeah, I make money from my YouTube channel. That's how I make money. That still matters to me, obviously. But you don't want to be so obsessed with just getting those clicks or just getting that money that you're willing to disregard your beliefs. And, you know, I think that we can find some really good common ground here, because it sounds like we're sort of in a similar position, at least as far as I'm really not a fan of labels. I don't like this idea that like, if I'm for a position, for example, legalizing marijuana, that suddenly makes me like left wing. I don't think it should be like that. I think we should just have ideas and talk about them. Kind of like what you were saying. You wrote an article criticizing Elizabeth Warren, which, yeah, Elizabeth Warren's kind of a dipshit. There's a lot to criticize her with. But at the same time, like, that doesn't mean that you're then just 100% all in on the right and you hate all Democrats. Like, there's nuance here that should be able to be addressed, right?
Right. And I've tried to do this in the sense that I honestly, setting aside personality and character and comments and conduct, which do matter, right? I probably agree with 80% of Trump administration policy. As I agree with everything outside of immigration and trade, pretty much. But I'm very against his policies in those 2 areas. But that's
like the tariffs and stuff.
Yeah, tariffs, immigration, border cruelty. I'm really against that. But I agree with tax cuts, deregulation, school choice, go down the list.
Right.
Love Neil Gorsuch. I'm a Gorsuch stan. But the point is that it is important to me that even if it's not 50-50, because I have a point of view, I am at least being consistent, and that the 10% of the time I do agree with Joe Biden. For example, I agree with his trade policies over Donald Trump's by a lot. I say so, because otherwise you're just a hack. And that's something I don't want to become. And I agree with you that the right is full of partisan talking heads and grifters and hacks. The thing where maybe I disagree with you is something that you said a minute ago. I think the left is just as full of incompetent people failing upwards and dishonest commentators. I mean, just look at CNN or MSNBC. I don't know how.
I think this is where if you don't mind, I'm sorry
to sure.
And by the way, like, I agree. I hate CNN. I think that a lot of the times people view the left as like this homogenous group. And then people do it with the right also. Don't get me wrong. I've said the right before. So I understand that. But there's actually like, there's a pretty significant difference between liberals and then left, like the
Yeah.
leftists. So like leftists, that's I guess where Vosh would fall. I don't agree with them on socialism or something like that, but their positions on like trans issues, police reform, stuff like that, it's much more in depth and it's much more nuanced rather than these places like CNN that are very much about the aesthetics. They're very much about the virtue signaling. They're like those cringy liberals that,
Right.
oh, you said something bad on Twitter in 2008, let's go cancel you. But like that isn't the left. That's just liberals.
No, yeah.
I
I
guess.
actually, my favorite people within the left are people like Tulsi Gabbard, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, who are like leftists. And I disagree with them on healthcare, economics, regulation, taxation. Most of them love Bernie Sanders, right?
Yeah.
But like you said, they are not part of that liberal establishment.
Right.
And so I guess I really am talking about like liberals, right?
Yeah.
But I think that whether it's the Washington Post employing Jennifer Rubin, who I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's just a total hack, unhinged columnist who has lost her mind. Or MSNBC employing Joy Reid, even after she wrote decades worth of homophobic blog posts, lied about fake Russian hacking. The FBI debunked it, and then she kept her job. Honestly, if we're being real, because of identity politics, because they don't have very many black women working for them at MSNBC, so they're afraid to fire one.
Right.
So I think the left has, well, and I get what you're saying. That's the liberal establishment, not the left. But I think left of center America, I mean, look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If there's a better example in American life of somebody failing up or somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about, but yet is constantly lifted up by a side of the political spectrum, I mean, you could say Trump, but you could also say AOC.
Sure. I think, and I absolutely think that that's a major flaw that happens on both sides. I just don't think that because the left is doing it, that means the right should go and do it also.
Fair.
And I don't think that that's what is intentionally done, but I do think that we have a lot more hacks on both sides because like there's a lack of people like you and I who are willing to just talk about what we like and don't like without clinging to party lines. It seems like there's a bunch of hacks on the left and then there's a bunch of hacks on the right, and you never really have anyone that's just telling it to you straight.
So I know we want to dive into deep on the issues. So let's talk about the LGBT issues. I mean, obviously, I've got a little bit of a unique perspective on this.
Right.
I'm in the LGBT community. I'm gay. I'm out. I'm in a relationship. Very public about it, despite working in conservative media. And I have to say, I think that we have to view gay and trans issues slightly separately. I would be willing to concede that much of the right is anti-trans and has some opinions maybe I disagree with, but I think the right has really become much more tolerant and accepting. Not everyone about gay issues, but when you look at gay marriage, it polls pretty decent among Republicans. And then I've operated for years now in a conservative space in journalism. I've met U.S. senators and politicians. I've been invited to their homes. Like I'm not saying it's perfect. And I'm not saying it's all, I've gotten some hateful stuff, trust me. And there's still some hateful people in prominent positions on the right who have very anti-gay views. But I think the ship is sailing. I really do. And I think it's made a lot of progress on that front. So before we get into the trans thing, would you agree with that?
I definitely think that trans issues have become more accepted on the right than they previously would have been.
Do you mean gay?
Or, I mean, gay issue. Oh, yeah. Gay issues, of course. I would definitely agree with gay. I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to
I was talking about gay issues as distinct from trans issues.
Gotcha. Yes, I do think that they've become a little more accepting of gay people. But a lot of the times it's not so much about like if individuals on the right or on the left don't like gay people or do like gay people. It's more about these sort of like statistical anomalies. For example, gay people disproportionate. Well, not even gay people. I guess that would be more trans issues, trans people. Can you explain to me why you think we should see gay people and trans people as like a separate issue?
Sure. For a couple of reasons. But one, first and foremost, is that sexual orientation and gender identity are like two different things. They're very distinct experiences. And even trans people and activists will tell you that someone's sexual orientation and their gender identity do not have to correspond. Right. So I view them almost as like talking about race and sex, right? Or race and gender, right? Like they're just distinct categories. And I can tell you from my experiences, and I've had a lot of conversations with trans people, about what it's like for them. And I have no more in common with it than you do. I spent my whole life feeling trapped by my gender that I was in terms of feeling like it's impossible for me to change. I'm attracted to another sex biologically. And so it's the opposite. It's really in many ways an opposite and distinct experience. So I guess I just don't really view them as having very much in common. I don't see what they do.
I think that where there's the commonality there is, I recognize that there's obviously a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, but I think that those two things are a little more closely related than race and sexual orientation, for example. Secondly, I think that a lot of people in the LGBT community as a whole have gone through similar experiences, or at least they've had similar struggles throughout their life. Like what I was saying earlier, like, statistically, gay and trans people are much more likely to be like kicked out of their home or ostracized or homeless. And there's still a lot of there's like a lack of societal acceptance towards these people. And even with what you said as far as gay people and the right, I don't think that there are people on the right that are, I mean, there are, but I don't think everyone on the right is like this raging homophobic bigot or something. But I do think that like the homophobia is a lot more subtle than that. And I recognize how that's kind of like a libtard buzzword now, but ask like a Christian conservative if they think being gay is a sin. Most of the time they'll answer yes, which by the way isn't true. Most likely they'll answer yes. And then if you ask them, okay, well, if you had two different candidates, one that was going to give gay people more rights, give them the right to adopt, or one candidate that wouldn't, most of these people would still vote for the candidate that wouldn't, because they still think that it's a sin to be gay. So
let me hop in there for a couple things. I actually don't think that someone having the belief that that being gay is a sin is an inherently homophobic thing to think.
Is it wouldn't you say it's racist if I said being black is a sin?
Well, but race and sexual orientation aren't the same thing, and
but they're both unchangeable facts. I
agree with that assessment. But one has a 1,000-year-long history of religion and a basis in the Bible, and the other one you'd just be spouting ignorance. I think that religion is a fundamental kind of American value, and there's so much history there that I think you can't really just conflate religious views on matters of sexual morality with race and racism. I think it's not generous to describe, millennia of religious views as akin to just racial bigotry on the difference of melanin and their skin tones.
Yes, but you're saying that it wouldn't necessarily be homophobic for someone to say that being gay is a sin. And
right,
I'm saying if it would be considered
things are a sin.
I know, but and that's bad. I think that these Christian conservatives that have this belief overwhelmingly would. I've literally done this example with debating people before. Like, most of them would vote for the candidate that would not further gay rights rather than the one that would. Even like current people in the Trump administration Supreme Court, I believe, are talking about challenging gay marriage again. So I don't think that everyone on the right is like a raging homophobe that wants to go kill gay people, by no means. But I think that a lot of people on the right, if you actually push them and had a real conversation, that you would find that they still hold some pretty backwards.
So let me flesh out what I mean when I'm talking about. Let's use the state of Utah as an example. The state of Utah is an extremely Republican, extremely conservative state that has a Republican governor, Republican legislature, and very Mormon religious population that believes being gay is a sin by and large. Yet they've also passed laws that ban anti-gay conversion therapy. They've also passed laws that add sexual orientation and gender identity to anti-discrimination law, they have exceptions for churches and religious schools, etc. And these people have their own private religious beliefs about sexual morality, but are welcoming and support equal rights under the law. I don't think those are homophobic people, even if they think being gay are a sin.
I would argue that even if the legislation has been passed or if things have changed, that you can still be suffering from consequences of like a societal viewpoint. I mean, we see that similarly, like with systemic racism. That was another conversation I was hoping to have with you. But like, actions have consequences. So I would say that, yeah, obviously not putting gay people through conversion therapy and recognizing them as like legal citizens is good, but that's also kind of a bare minimum. And when you have a societal, a society that overwhelmingly views your lifestyle as a sinful, like, abomination against God, I think that kind of homophobic belief will still be amplified in our day-to-day societal life, even if it's still kind of covered on a legislative basis.
I guess
For
it
example,
matters.
like, it's illegal to murder people in this country,
Right.
yet trans people are, and I know I'm saying trans people because I don't have the stats offhand on the gay people, but trans people, for example, statistically are far more likely to be victims of like murder or be killed or victims of violent crime.
Right, but there are certain context to those statistics.
I know. I understand that. And because I think that there needs to also be a conversation, like, trans people should not be getting in bed with a guy and then revealing the fact that they have a penis. Like, that needs to be talked about beforehand, but I also don't think that would justify murdering anyone.
I certainly
obviously,
either.
And I know you don't think that either. I'm not even trying to suggest that.
But I guess it matters what your final. So I am a libertarian, and I consider myself an American constitutionalist pluralist. So basically, I am fine with religious people having whatever views they have, as long as we live side by side and don't force those views on each other. So
sure, that's kind of how it's gonna have to be. Like, I'm not
right.
I don't want to come across. I'm not advocating to legislate against people having homophobic beliefs. I just think that a conversation needs to be had, and that a lot of people who don't believe themselves to be homophobic, when you push them, kind of are.
I guess, I mean, it's an imperfect conversation, right? Because no one, I think, is 100% unbiased on anything. Right. No one is 100% racist or 0% racist. Everyone has it's somewhere, it's shades of gray. We all have some prejudices, some biases.
I just think that if you have that biasy, like, a lot of Christians are biased towards gay people. Well, why? They say it's because it's a sin. It's not really because it's a sin, because it's not. You can literally debate that with Christians, and it's not.
Well, look, I can't really speak to Christianity because I'm just not very familiar with it.
I used to be. I mean, I was raised Christian.
But it is in the Bible, and it is the Catholic Church's official position. So they have some basis for thinking.
There is stuff in the Bible, yes, that says, like, laying with another man is an abomination or whatever. But if you look at the biblical context, it's not talking about gay marriage the way we recognize it today. So a lot of the times, like, these Christian conservatives who say they're against gay marriage because it's a sin, what it really comes down to is gay and trans people make them feel icky, so they use the Bible as a justification. So and I don't think that's what everyone's doing. I want to be very charitable. Like, I have conservative friends, but I also have family who I've talked to that I love deeply. But when I have a conversation with them, I can tell you just don't think you think gay people are kind of icky. You don't really have a biblical basis for this.
I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying that what you're describing isn't a real thing, as much as I'm saying I don't know that I think that applies to all or even a majority of religious people.
It would be so hard to prove too.
Right.
I'm not saying I recognize that too, that there's no statistics on this. We can talk about majorities when we have statistics available, but I'm just saying from my own experience.
Let's touch on the trans thing a little bit more, flesh that out, and then we can move on to talk about some of the other systemic racism, Black Lives Matter stuff that I know we want to touch on. Basically, let me just explain to you kind of my view on trans issues, and you can explain where you differ and why.
Okay.
Essentially, my view is that I think all people should have equal rights under the law, including trans people. I think they should have the same rights as gay people. Ultimately, I think adults or teenagers or youth that have gender dysphoria oftentimes should transition, and that's what's best for them. And I would respect their pronouns and whatever. I am laissez-faire libertarian in that sense. Okay. So at the end of the day, though, especially given how I've always felt that same-sex attraction is the basis of homosexuality and is inchangeable and immutable and based in science, I don't think that people can ultimately change their sex biologically. I think they could identify as the other gender, and I'm okay with that. But in circumstances such as transgender female athletes competing in women's sports, I think it is anti-scientific and ignores the reality of biological sex. I have no problem with trans men competing in men's sports because there's no disadvantage.
Right.
So, but I think that the biology aspect of it, to me, I feel is very real, and I don't think is bigoted to point out and to argue.
I would agree with that.
The only other thing is that I oppose medical or chemical transitioning of any minors or children, simply because I know that the studies are mixed, but some studies show a high percentage of gender dysphoric youth basically growing out of it or becoming gay when they're older, gay or lesbian. And others, it's just, I know about myself at 12 years old. I couldn't have made an irreversible decision that would have potentially made me unable to have children at 12. I mean, I didn't have my sexuality figured out at 12. I wouldn't have wanted to make a decision that would alter my body. I think it's a question of informed consent. But both of those views that I've just laid out would be described as transphobic by the liberal LGBT activists and trans activists.
Well, I will explain to you why I don't think that any of your positions are transphobic at all. And in fact, I think that we actually have a lot of common ground here, but I think that some of your positions might be just slightly misled. First and foremost, what you talk about with no one can change their sex. It's important to remember that sex is bimodal. So like it's on a spectrum. There's no real one defined, like what makes a male or what makes a female. Like that can vary so much. There's a lot of variance there. So you might be right. And I think that there's no one more aware of the fact that they are biologically male or biologically female or whatever than trans people. Usually the reason they have gender dysphoria, the reason that even exists, is because they're so aware of the fact that their gender identity doesn't correspond with their biology. So I think that, like, I don't think that trans people, like if someone is biologically male and then they identify as a woman, I don't think that trans person thinks their penis magically turns into a vagina. I think that they are aware they're still biologically male, but they're more comfortable aligning with the societal roles that we currently prescribe to males or men. I guess I'd say men, not males. Sorry. It's definitely kind of complicated, but I mean, can you change your sex? It just depends on what the defining characteristic of sex is. If we're going to go based on genitals, if we're going to say that's what defines a man or a male and a female is penis or vagina, and then you get your penis removed, then maybe you can change your sex. But then there's chromosomes and there's other variants. And then there's hormones. And then there's so many different variants of sex. It's on a scale. It's not just one thing versus another. So whether they can change their sex or not is kind of irrelevant. I think as far as like the discussion goes, trans people competing against or biological men competing against women in sports, that isn't really happening at nearly the rate that it's being kind of made to look like it is. At least a lot of right-wing media makes it look like this is happening all the time.
They do blow it up, but it is happening. They do blow it up.
Well, they do blow it up, and there hasn't even been, for example, trans people have been able to compete in the Olympics since like 2004. A trans person has never even qualified for the Olympics.
Well, how about this though? Because right near where I'm from in Connecticut, the high school state championships for female athletes for track and field were dominated by two trans girls. Right. And they won a bunch of first place. I'm not saying this is like a pervasive thing that's destroying everyday life. But it is a thing, and it is much debated in both liberal media and in right of center media.
It absolutely can be unfair if those biological women are going against a biological male. I agree with that. However, it's also important to remember that if trans people are transitioning, going through hormones, going through the process that you need to transition actually puts your strength level much more on par with your female counterparts if you're competing against women. But that then I think we could probably come to common ground that you can't just be a biological male and then say I'm a woman and then go hop in to the girls' team. Obviously.
So I agree with that, but I think what you're saying is definitely like objectively true. Transitioning and taking hormones does reduce it, but there are some aspects such as height and bone density and wingspan and other things that set in before your transition and don't go away that are still biologically different.
Yeah, and there's also like there have already been sort of questions about this issue before too. Like there was an Olympic runner, I forget her name now, but I know she was a Black woman who had like an exceedingly high amount of testosterone.
Caster Semenya.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So like she was a female, but she had a lot of testosterone. They didn't know how to categorize her. So I think we're kind of figuring that out. But it was good for me to recognize that it's not really happening very often. And even in the cases where it has, there was a case with a biological male dominating females in wrestling. The reason that biological male was actually a part of that, or I'm sorry, no, that would have been a biological female who was transitioning into a man. So because that biological female who was taking testosterone was even in that team was actually because there were rules against trans sports, and she was unable to compete against, or he was unable to compete against males because he was still biologically female.
And that's dumb.
Right, which is very dumb. So like there's it's really a messy, like there's a lot of nuance there. I agree that like biological males shouldn't just be jumping on a track with chicks and then dominating them. That definitely leads to unfair treatment. But
what about childhood transitioning?
Yeah, that's the other one I wanted to touch on too. I mean, it's kind of another thing that's not really happening. Like, I agree with you that kids shouldn't be getting irreversible treatment, but no, like children aren't. The most that they'll go on
puberty blockers at 12.
Right, which is reversible.
Puberty blockers, so it can cause infertility if they go on puberty blockers and then they stay on it and they never go through their original sex's puberty, and then they start taking the opposite sex's hormones. They're 16 years old and they're at the end of that, and they're infertile in some cases.
First of all, what happens with the puberty blockers is usually it would be a kid around 10, 11, or 12, whenever they start going into puberty. They would go to multiple therapists, be confirmed gender dysphoric first. And once that is then confirmed, they might consider the option of puberty blockers, which temporarily pauses your puberty. And then you can go off of it and resume your regular puberty, or you can stay on the puberty blockers until you are of age to consent to hormones. But it's the hormones that are more likely to make you infertile, not
and they do give those to minors. They do give hormones to minors.
I would have to see.
They don't wait to 18. They wait till 16, 17.
I would have to see some studies on that. I mean, it's possible, but I know that they give for the most part puberty blockers to kids that are younger, and that's because going through the wrong puberty as a trans person can greatly raise your risk of committing suicide in the future. So it's almost like a life or death type thing. So putting kids on puberty blockers, it can cause weaker bone density. That's one of the downsides I've heard from it.
But it is a medical and chemical transition for a minor who can't really give informed consent to that. A 10-year-old doesn't even know what sex and gender are.
Well, that's actually not true. There have been studies that have shown that younger kids are pretty much fully aware of their gender identity, just the same as cis kids are. And again, we're talking about gender identity. For kids who are trans, the best thing that's recommended for them is to first socially transition. So like no surgery, no hormones, nothing.
Yeah,
just if a male is identifying as a girl and he's more comfortable wearing a dress, let him wear a dress. Who cares? That alone helps. And then if they're continuing to show,
I don't oppose that. I don't oppose social transition for gender dysphoric kids.
Why would you oppose the puberty blockers? Because they're generally harmless. They are, and they've been being used for decades, and they've even been used for cis kids. There's a disease where cis kids, they start entering puberty too early, and they're put on puberty blockers.
But the idea that puberty blockers just pause things and don't cause potentially irreversible damage, I don't know that I think that's correct. Because if you never go through your original sex's puberty, you never can reproduce.
Well,
if you're on them,
I recognize there are serious things that you need to like consider, but that's going through hormones. Puberty blockers, I can send you an article on it. Hold on. I'll send. I don't expect you to look at it on stream, but actually, no, I'll send it to you after this because I have it open. But I have an article that I can send you on that. And puberty blockers, it's from Healthline. Like, it's just a basic thing explaining what it does, and it's a long process. Children have to go through a lot of different therapy. Yeah.
The current medical establishment standards do not allow doctors to even probe. When children say I'm trans, they have to accept and affirm that. They can't say anything like, "Are you sure? What does that mean?" They can't do any sort of pushback. It just has to be I accept.
Where did you hear that from? Where did you hear that from? Because I mean, like, in order even for adults to go through any kind of surgery, they need to be confirmed gender dysphoric, and the only way you can do that is by talking to a therapist.
But that therapist has to accept at face value your gender identification under the I believe it's under the either the American Medical Association or American Psychiatric Association, and we can circle back on that. But
after this talk, why don't you send that to me? Because I'd be happy to look into that. I know that overwhelmingly the medical consensus is that trans people are valid. But the idea that like they can't question it is absurd to me, considering that like there have been multiple high profile cases involving transgender children. And again, for kids to even go on puberty blockers, I've talked to people who have talked to people who are under the age of 18 trying to transition. It's very, very challenging. So if that's the case, I would be very curious to know. And I think that would be a flaw. Obviously, that needs to be challenged. But for the most part, what's happening right now, all fear mongering aside, is children are meeting with multiple different counselors and multiple different doctors to make sure that they are, without a doubt, confirmed gender dysphoric before they are then maybe offered the option of puberty blockers, which for the most part is a safe and reversible process. They wouldn't go on hormones or anything like that until they were older.
Not until they're 18, though. They go on it before the age of 18.
If they go on it before the age of 18, I would be opposed to that, actually. So I'd have to look into that.
Sure.
But for the most part, putting kids on puberty blockers, it's not like chemical castration by any means. And it's the best thing for the child. I mean, it's almost like arguing that we shouldn't put a kid with cancer on chemotherapy because the chemotherapy can cause nerve damage. Like,
see, I think that's I think that's not a fair comparison. So
why?
I think that in the case of a child who is truly gender dysphoric, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who a trans person knows from age 5, they feel like they're the different gender identity. I don't dispute that is the best course of eventual treatment, is medical and chemical transition. The problem is, and I know that there's a lot of dispute as to what extent this is a thing, but there obviously are desisters. And in my view, there obviously is something of a social contagion effect among kind of the 10 to 14-year-old Instagram, Tumblr, like young generation. I mean, I was listening to someone the other day who said that in their daughter's like 8th grade class, a group of 9 girls all decided they're trans.
Well, yeah. And listen, I think that doesn't really speak for the LGBT community entirely. And I don't think that those kids, if they were just doing it for attention, they would not be confirmed gender dysphoric. There's no way in hell they would ever get put on puberty blockers. It's also important to remember that, like, whenever things become more and more socially acceptable, they become more popular as well. And that sometimes means that it just isn't authentic. I mean, for example, like when interracial marriage had become more accepted, and then eventually when it was legalized, you saw a massive uptick in people that were marrying interracially. Like, there's always a large burst of acceptance or more people claiming to be gay or trans or whatever when that becomes more socially acceptable. But I don't think that a couple cringy like teenage girls saying they're trans for attention is an argument against like the medical data, which pretty clearly shows that puberty blockers for children are generally safe. And I recognize also, like, I want to point out something you said here, because you said you recognize how that might eventually be the best course of action. But the problem is it's not, we can't always wait, because it's about actually preventing that wrong puberty in order to lower the potential suicide rate later on in life.
So I think you have to wait, because otherwise you're performing potentially, if you're going into the hormone therapies and you're delaying puberty past a certain point, you are causing basically permanent potential medical
hormones.
Effects.
I know, but it's not hormones. We're talking about puberty blockers. Puberty blockers and hormones are two
Oh, I understand, but you take puberty blockers as the first step, and the next step is to take hormones for the opposite sex after a few years.
If you feel ready, yes. I know that it's disputed. Apparently, it's sometimes 16, maybe 18. I always thought it was 18, but if it was younger, it's younger than that.
If people are doing it after 18, I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is doing it before 18.
Yeah, but kids before 18 who have been confirmed by like doctors and therapists to be gender dysphoric, I feel like let's just give them the best treatment, which in this case would be socially transitioning, and then maybe puberty blockers. Like, it's not like a kid just walks in and is like, "Hey, doctor, I like the color pink," and he's like, "Oh, cut her dick off." Like, that's not what's happening.
No, and one thing I will grant you, and then maybe we can shift topics, is that there is a caricature of trans issues that is pervaded throughout kind of right-wing media, right? When you see articles from the Federalist and it's a picture of a man in a dress with a beard, and it says, and it's some story about trans people. And like,
Blair White does the same exact thing, by the way. Blair White does the exact same thing.
I mean, she obviously just apologized for one of those videos that she got wrong, and I don't want to turn it into a Blair White commentary.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying.
I'm saying, obviously, she did do that, at least in that one video. And that is a problem. And I think what's interesting is that I feel like you're being generous and fair about this, and I think so am I, but there's this tendency that we can't even have this conversation like without just being called transphobic. If you have any opinion, it's just transphobic.
I am not called. I hope that you don't feel like
No. I'm saying you don't do that, but I'm saying the modern LGBT media and activists do that all the time.
Right, and that's I will say this: one, that's stupid and dumb. To get like triggered so much about anyone's belief that you just like shut them out. I think it's very stupid. I've never been that type of person, and I never will be. Secondly, I think it kind of comes down to one, a lot of the times they write it off as transphobic because they take it as like denying their existence, I think. Not defending it, I'm just saying. And lastly, a lot of the times these people who shut you down, like, it's my job to have conversations and to film videos and like share my ideas and stuff. It's not always these people's jobs. Sometimes they're just trans. They want to live their life.
Sometimes they're activists and journalists.
Well, if they're activists and journalists and they shut you out that way, then I will say that's some cuck shit. And, you know, I shat on Brandon Straka. He did this video with where he was actually arguing Black Lives Matter. Speak of the devil, but you know, for subject matter. But the girl that he was arguing was like, "You're not black. You don't understand what it's like." And I was like, "Oh my God." I'm like, "I'm a white guy. I can explain BLM without invoking race." Like, yeah. So
right. I mean, that's like, I'm not sitting here saying that you can't have an opinion on LGBT because you're a straight.
Right, exactly.
That's not an argument. That's
right.
Identity politics. I don't believe in that. That's not an argument. That's just citing an identity. If the argument is the same, if it comes out of my mouth or yours, it's either valid or it's not.
Right, exactly. And see, I think that we have some really good common ground there.
So let's talk about that issue, Black Lives Matter, and kind of the issue of racial inequality and injustice. Let me just kind of lay out my view, because it's not the stereotypical conservative view, but it's not the liberal view either. So okay. I think that I support criminal justice reform. And this is actually one of the things I write about and advocate for, to make the criminal justice system fairer. I support legalizing marijuana and decriminalizing all drugs outside of marijuana.
Brad.
I support qualified immunity reform, maybe repeal, sentencing reform, prison reform, First Step Act. I'm very libertarian on issues of criminal justice.
Yeah.
That said, and I also acknowledge that there are racial disparities in the criminal justice system, right? Like crack versus cocaine, like marijuana, Black people are more likely to get arrested.
Yeah.
So if the question is, are there systemic racial disparities in America? The answer is yes. If the question is, but I also, on the other hand, believe that America is the freest place and the best place it has ever been for a Black person. Is it perfect? No. But it is, I think, I love America, and I don't believe America is systemically evil or racist or bad. And I will say that is the narrative I feel is advanced by most Black Lives Matter activists, by, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project. Whereas they look at America and its racial shortcomings as like the defining feature of something evil. I look at them as the shortcomings of something with beautiful potential.
And I think that I actually have that similar view also. I've always said that I love America, and it's because I love this country that I want to see it become better for everyone who lives here. I absolutely think this country has amazing potential. And I also think there's something to be said about how this country does provide opportunity for a lot of people. I believe it's something like 70% of the wealth earned in this country is earned by people who are not previously wealthy, or they earned it themselves or something. I mean, there's definitely like a lot of great things about America. There's a lot of potential here, but the systemic racism conversation, at least, and I don't have your stereotypical liberal approach on this either, because I don't believe that America is just inherently evil, racist, and bad and needs to be abolished or something. I think that what it is that systemic racism, and when I say that, I'm meaning it in a very specific way. I mean historically racist policies that, although they might be done away with, like on the books, right? There's no more laws that say Black people have to be kept out of this location or whatever. The consequences of those policies are still greatly affecting Blacks today. So a common argument is when it comes to Black people disproportionately getting targeted by police. The very quick go-to one is, well, Black people commit more crime, which is true. But the question that I think a lot of right-wingers don't like getting into is, why do Black people commit more crime?
It's nothing inherent to their race.
Right. It is nothing inherent to their race. And it has everything to do with the fact that they were historically put in these positions due to slavery and then Jim Crow and then redlining.
Well, and it's socioeconomic.
Right. Exactly. See, you and I are much more on the same page with this. I think that, yeah, like poverty leads to criminality. That is like a common fact.
Right.
That's a socioeconomic fact. That's what happens. So instead of saying like a lot of the conservative narrative is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, stop being a criminal, don't commit crime. For me, I'm like, why are people committing crime? And let's fix that. Let's fix the systemic poverty. Like, why are so many Black people living in poverty? Well, if you look at the way redlining policies affected Black people, even to this day, like the last time someone was caught using a red line map was like 2015.
Right.
These policies still have an effect on Black people today.
But let me touch on that because sure. I don't disagree with any of that. But what I do disagree with is the same people who are pushing this narrative, right? This systemic racism driven by these policies are the same people that want the government to be bigger and more powerful and have more influence over our life. By and large, maybe not you, I'm not saying you, but the people who push the systemic racism narrative are the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the New York Times opinion page. And these are the same people who want the government to control our healthcare. They want the government to control most of the economy, right? Sure. They want to expand all the government power, the same one that created injustice historically. And I don't think they're wrong about that. They want to use it and just think that it will be good this time when they use it. And I think that's just dangerously naive.
But well, I agree that it is naive, but it's partially correct if you think of it in the sense that the government should operate the will of the people. So as like a libertarian, I think you could probably agree with that too. Like, I
think it should, but I think it's inherently public choice theory, right? Politicians will always serve their own interests.
Well, that's true, but it's not like the government that necessarily created inequality. Systemic racism is just any kind of a system that disproportionately negatively affects Black people.
The government enforced redlining is government policy.
I know. Government did a lot of bad, but that doesn't mean that government can't also be used to do a lot of good.
Government created this massive problem is more government, but this time the right people will control it. And I think that's naive.
But it wasn't just the government. It was the people in the government at the time. So the racist people at the homeowners association that made the redlining policies or whatever, those people are no longer there any longer. So the government is still operating, but it's now full of people that have different goals. But I think that I do think that you're right, because it doesn't always matter about the people in that system. Like a lot of people in our criminal justice system, they aren't racist. They aren't walking around thinking about how much they love Black people, but they are still playing a role in this system that's disproportionately negatively affecting Black people. So I think that it's a complicated subject. I recognize what you mean, that it is flawed for these people to think that big daddy government's going to just step in. However, I will say, ideally, the government should operate the will of the people, and the government should be operated by people. So that should be reflective of the people's new progression in their goals and in their views. But I also will concede what you said, that yes, hoping that government can just step in and magically fix this stuff, especially right now with the way our government operates, is extremely naive. And that's why I'm much more for the concept of pushing for social change, like what we're seeing with BLM, with tens of millions of Americans marching on the streets against injustice. This is the kind of thing that I think is going to push for a bigger change, at least right now. The government will come later down the line.
Let me touch on the Black Lives Matter issue and then flesh out my position, and then you can kind of describe where you're at. But basically, I think one thing Republicans and conservative commentators miss is that BLM is a different thing than BLM TM. So like there is an official organization called Black Lives Matter that gets tons of donations from corporations and people who support the movement. Right. And that organization is run by people who are Marxists. It run with an agenda on its website that says abolish the nuclear family. Those are all facts. I can cite those to you. Now, that being said, that organization is a little fringe, and most people who say Black Lives Matter or hashtag Black Lives Matter just believe in kind of a general movement or justice. So I oppose Black Lives Matter TM, but I support the kind of generic message of fixing the policing system and racial equality. Now, here's the problem. I was very on board after George Floyd's death with the first couple of weeks. When it started to turn to mass rioting and looting, that, from my perspective, right, I view property rights and the economic future of minority and urban communities that were rioted and looted will be so damaged and so harmed, and so many innocent people were hurt by that, that then I started to think, well, listen, there's 10 people a year, unarmed black men, who are killed by police, and we've already got 20 people who have died in the last 3 weeks or the last 4 months of riots. So it's like that almost became a more pressing objection and problem to me.
Okay, I understand that, and I do think that the rioting is really inappropriate. I think that whenever there's like a massive movement, there are going to be pieces of shit that come along and try and exploit that. I don't know if you're familiar with a study that actually found that the majority of the BLM protests were peaceful. So,
but that's kind of, so it was 93% were peaceful, right? That's literally, though, hundreds of violent events.
It was around like 200 or so violent events versus
That's
thousands.
a lot.
but there was like over 7,000 peaceful events.
But I guess that's
so. Why does
the
the violent? We can't really say that because it's in the minority that it's like still matters. I don't know. Like,
of the people,
it does matter.
Tacitly approving of it or failed to condemn it, and oftentimes.
I don't know. Yeah, there's hypocrites all over, but I can say, as far as my position goes, I'm against the rioting, I'm against the looting, but I think that it's a little uncharitable to make your main focus that, when the main focus is Black people getting killed by police. And it's not just killed by police, it's the fact that when a Black man is murdered by police, it is indicative of a larger issue with criminal justice, all the discrimination there. So there's a little bit more to it than just that. And also, if the majority of them have been peaceful, I don't think that just focusing purely on the violence is a good way of going about it. I think that we can condemn the looting, but again, why are people looting and rioting? Like, why is any of this happening? Do you think the looters and rioters care that you are telling them that it's like a disgusting thing to do? Do you think that they care that I'm telling them that? No. So I think that it would be much better for everyone, including the minority communities, to examine the underlying systemic problems still, and in turn, these issues like looting and Black on Black violence and so forth will actually be reduced. I guess
I disagree with your first premise that it's not a big deal because it was 95 or 93% peaceful. I mean, the coronavirus has a 99% survival rate. It's still a deadly disease that has ravaged our society.
Right, but what we're talking about here is like a couple hundred violent events. I mean,
we're talking about thousands of businesses that were burned and destroyed. Thousands. We're talking about actually, like, listen to this statistic that I can send you after this. But the period from the George Floyd riots and looting actually will go down in history as the most, by insurance claims, the most expensive period of rioting and looting in American history. It surpassed all the other ones.
Oh, sure,
I can send you that statistic. So you're talking about billions of dollars in damage and over 20 people that were killed in all the chaos: store owners, looters, police, security guards.
But why can't we? I'm not defending that at all. I recognize how horrible that is, but why can't we acknowledge that looting is bad, but like injustice is also bad? It's not really either or.
But I think the movement, I think broadly the left, though, has turned a blind eye to the looting, or said quietly once, we don't support that. And yet they kind of just...
I recognize that it still has a significant impact on those people. And for that, I am sorry. I don't want there to be looting, but there have even been other studies that have shown that a lot of the violence and the looting and the rioting came from people outside the neighborhood, people who are just looking to cause trouble. So I think that when we have 93% of the BLM protests thus far peaceful, and then we have other studies showing that a lot of the violence has come from outside the neighborhood, it didn't even come from the BLM movement itself. I just think that, like, highlighting purely on the rioting and the looting, yeah, it should be condemned, but like there's a lot more to it than just the looting.
The problem is not just if all the people on the left were saying rioting and looting is bad, that's just a small fringe, we condemn them, then I would agree with you. But Kamala Harris literally raised money to bail out rioters and looters.
Kamala Harris is a piece of shit too. Like,
right. So that's what I'm saying. That's the Democrat.
That's the thing is,
I'm not assigning that to you.
I know, but I'm not.
That is the Democrat Party. They have really been friendly,
I hate the
and
Democrats
flirty with this.
And I don't like the Democrat Party at all. I can tell you that right now. I recognize them for what they are. I recognize them for being virtue signaling little shills. that care more about political correctness than actually making the world a better
So
place.
I saw this meme that I bet you would like. It's a plane dropping
Mhm.
bombs, and then it's like under Republicans. Then on the next image, it's a plane dropping bombs, and it says under Democrats, and it's the same plane but with a BLM and a rainbow sticker on it.
Exactly. That's hilarious. And that's exactly how I would describe liberals versus leftists. Liberals are very much about that aesthetic. They want everything to look pretty, you know, more female drone strikes, that kind of crap, right? It's not actually about fixing the real problems. It's about just putting like a cherry on top of the big pile of shit.
So we're gonna have to come to a wrap soon. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I know we disagree on a fair amount, but I think we both approached this with a very kind of fair-minded tactic. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for coming on.
Of course. And
now,
hey, I hope that I really quickly just want to say, not only thanks for having me on, but I hope I was able to change your perception a little bit. You know, not everyone who identifies as a little more on the left is like afraid of conversation. I'm more than happy to have debate.
Listen, we need more people like you. And you told me
and we need more people like you.
We need you told me about a couple of your friends on the left who will come on my show, and I want you to introduce me to them as well, because I want more people from the left. I've been emailing them and asking them. And
I have Vosh. I'm sure he's a socialist, communist, whatever you want to call him.
I would love to have a socialist on, and we can talk about economics for an hour, and I will tell them why I think they're wrong without insulting them. And I hope all I ask is that they do the same. So to close it out, Hunter, tell us what your food take is. I ask every guest this. I've had people tell me they like bacon and peanut butter. I've had people tell me they like to eat ramen noodles raw. Some weird stuff. So let me hear yours.
My controversial food take. Now I feel like I have nothing. I was just going to say I like pineapple on pizza, but
that's not super.
That's not really that controversial anymore.
That's boring.
Right?
You got to do better than that.
I'm just so used to having like other controversial opinions that when it comes to food, I'm like.
So what's funny is that I just tweet all the time hot food takes, and people get more mad about those than any of my kind of extreme political views on some things.
That's hilarious. Yeah, people take that food shit really seriously.
They do. Like when I have my steak well done and I post a picture of it, I get more hate on that than on any of my hot takes. I'm out.
No, I take back what we said. We cannot have a conversation. This guy just got his steak well done. Yeah, no.
All right. Well, thanks again, Hunter. And thanks everybody for listening. If you like the show, make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and leave us a rating and review on iTunes and Apple Podcasts too. That really helps. So that's it for today, and we'll talk to you guys all next week.
You are listening to Breaking Boundaries with Brad Palumbo.